was halfway through my dinner when Emily smiled at me and said, "Today felt peaceful, didn't it?" I nodded and said, "Yeah, it finally feels like things are settled." She leaned back, stirring her drink, and said casually, "Daniel texted me today." I laughed without thinking and replied, "Your old coworker." She shook her head and said, "No, my ex." My chest tightened, but I forced a smile and asked, "Why would he text you now?" She shrugged and said, "He's going through a hard time." I told myself it was nothing, that names from the past didn't matter anymore. I said, "You didn't tell me you were still in touch with him." Emily frowned and replied, "I didn't think I needed to." I tried to sound calm and asked, "What kind of hard time?" She sighed and said, "He's alone. His life didn't turn out how he hoped." I joked, "That's not your responsibility." She looked at me and said softly, "I just feel bad." I laughed again, louder than I meant to, and said, "You're too kind sometimes." Inside, my stomach twisted, but I told myself I was being dramatic and insecure for no reason. Emily said, "You understand, right?" I paused and answered, "Of course I do." I didn't understand. I watched her fingers tighten around her phone. She said, "He always depended on me emotionally." I replied, "That sounds unhealthy." She snapped back, "You're making it weird." I raised my hands and said, "I'm not. I'm just surprised." She looked away and said, "You know I'm loyal to you." I nodded again, even though something felt off. I kept telling myself trust meant silence, not questions. The next day at work, Ryan leaned against my desk and asked, "You look exhausted. Everything okay?" I said, "Yeah, just normal stuff." He laughed and replied, "That's a lie." I hesitated, then said, "Emily talked about her ex last night." Ryan raised an eyebrow and asked, with sympathy. I said, "Yeah, a lot of it." He crossed his arms and said, "Sympathy doesn't come back unless feelings never left." I laughed and replied, "You're overthinking." Ryan shook his head and said, "I've seen this before." I told him, I trust her, even though my voice didn't sound convincing. That evening, I sat beside Emily on the couch and said, "Ryan thinks I should worry." She scoffed and replied, "Your coworker doesn't know me." I said, "He just cares." She said, "So do I." I smiled and answered, "I know." She leaned into me, but her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and turned it face down. I asked, "Everything okay?" She replied too quickly, "Yeah." I nodded, staring at the blank television, telling myself not to imagine things I couldn't prove. Later that night, Emily lay beside me, scrolling quietly. I asked, "Can you put the phone away?" She said, "Just a second." I watched her smile at the screen, small and private. I said, "Who's that?" She replied, "No one important." My chest felt hollow. I turned away and closed my eyes. In the dark, I realized that smile didn't belong to me anymore, and pretending not to notice hurt more than asking ever could. I sat across from Emily at the kitchen table and said, "We need to talk." She didn't look surprised. She said, "About Daniel." I nodded and replied, "About how often you talk to him." She crossed her arms and said, "I didn't hide it." I answered, "You didn't share it either." She sighed and said, "I didn't think it mattered." I leaned forward and asked, "Does it matter to you?" She hesitated, then said, "He's struggling." I said, "That wasn't my question." She looked away and replied, "I care about him as a human being." I swallowed and said, "How long have you been talking?" She said, "A few weeks." I asked, "Every day?" She said quietly, "Most days." My chest tightened. I said, "And you never thought to ask how I felt?" She replied, "I didn't think you'd react like this." I laughed without humor and said, "Like what?" "Hurt." She snapped, defensive. I shook my head and said, "I'm not attacking you." She said, "It feels like you are." I said, "Because I'm asking questions." Emily leaned back and said, "I can't just abandon someone who once mattered." Her words hit harder than any insult. I replied, "And what about someone who matters now?" She said, "You're twisting it." I said, "I'm standing right here." She rubbed her temples and said, "Why are you making this so big?" I answered, "Because it's big to me." She said, "You're being insecure." I felt myself shrink and said, "I'm just trying to be honest." She replied, "Honesty doesn't mean control." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her sentence kept repeating in my head. I picked up my phone and called Sophia. She answered immediately and said, "What's wrong?" I said, "How do you know something's wrong?" She replied, "You never call this late." I hesitated and said, "Emily's talking to her ex." Sophia went quiet, then said, "And?" I said, "She says it's sympathy." Sophia replied, "Does it feel like sympathy to you?" I said, "No," she said gently, "then trust that feeling." I asked, "Am I overreacting?" She answered, "You're reacting." The next day, Emily said, "Did you calm down?" I replied, "I didn't sleep." She said, "That's not my fault." I said, "You could at least acknowledge it hurts." She replied, "I'm not responsible for your emotions." I stared at her and said, "Then why do mine matter less than his?" She said, "This isn't a competition." I answered, "It feels like one I'm losing." She accused, "You're projecting." I said, "I'm begging you to listen." She said, "I am listening." I replied, "Then hear me." The arguments kept circling. I said, "Please set boundaries." She said, "I won't be told who I can talk to." I said, "I'm not telling you. I'm asking." She said, "And I'm saying no." Each conversation ended with me apologizing. I said, "I'm sorry for pushing." She said, "Thank you." She never said sorry back. The imbalance sat heavy in my chest, but I kept hoping patience would fix it. One evening, Emily grabbed her keys and said, "I'm meeting Daniel." I asked, "Tonight?" She replied, "For closure." I said, "Closure for who?" She said, "For me." I watched her leave and realized my feelings weren't part of that closure at all. I checked the clock and said out loud, "She should be home by now." The room stayed quiet. I sent a message and typed, "Did you get there safe?" No reply. I waited 10 minutes and sent another. "Everything okay?" I told myself not to panic. I sat on the couch and said, "She just needs time." The clock kept moving. My phone stayed silent. I whispered, "Don't do this to yourself." Fear crept in slowly, then settled heavy in my chest. I called Emily and listened to it ring. No answer. I said to myself, "She's talking." I stood up and paced, saying, "It's just closure." My thoughts argued back. I imagined him touching her hand. I imagined her crying. I imagined her choosing. I hated that I had no proof and no peace. I said, "Why didn't she text?" The silence answered nothing. I felt stupid waiting, but leaving felt worse. Waiting felt like punishment I hadn't earned. An hour later, there was a knock. I opened the door and said, "Ryan." He looked at my face and said, "I knew it." I asked, "How?" He replied, "You don't go quiet unless you're breaking." I stepped aside and said, "She's still not home." Ryan said, "Sit down." I said, "Don't tell me what I already know." He answered, "I'm telling you what you're avoiding." I said, "She promised it was just talk." He said, "Promises don't erase patterns." I snapped, "You don't know her." He said, "I know you." Ryan sat across from me and said, "You matter." I laughed and said, "Doesn't feel like it." He replied, "You shouldn't have to compete with a memory." I said, "I'm not competing." He said, "Then why are you waiting?" I had no answer. He stood up and said, "Call me if you need me." I said, "Thanks for coming." He paused and said, "Don't disappear for someone who already left." Then he walked out. It was past midnight when the door opened. Emily stepped in quietly. I said, "You're late." She said, "I lost track of time." I asked, "You didn't think to text?" She replied, "I didn't want to argue." I said, You didn't want to reassure me. She avoided my eyes and said, "That's not fair." I stayed quiet. She filled the space with excuses. He was emotional. He needed to talk. I didn't plan it to be that long. I listened and said nothing. Emily finally said, "Say something." I looked at her and said, "What do you want me to say?" She said, "Anything." I replied, "You chose him tonight." She said quickly, "That's not true." I asked, "Then why was I alone?" She said, "He cried." I asked, "About what?" She said, "About losing me." My chest tightened. I said, "And?" She whispered, "He said he still loves me." I stayed silent. She added, "I felt confused." I said, "Did you tell him you love him too?" She said, "No." I asked, "Did you stop him?" She hesitated and said, "I listened." That answer hurt the most. I nodded and said, "I see." She said, "You're being cold." I replied, "I'm being quiet." She said, "Say you're upset." I said, "You already know." She reached for my hand. I pulled away and said, "I need space." Emily went to the bedroom and closed the door. I sat alone again, but this time I wasn't waiting. I realized something simple and sharp. I wasn't the person she ran to anymore. I was the person she explained things to after. I packed a bag before sunrise and said out loud, "I need space." Emily was still asleep, or pretending to be. I didn't wake her. I sent one message saying, "I'm staying somewhere safe." Then I left. I called Sophia from the car and said, "Can I come over?" She didn't ask why. She just said, "I'll make tea." That answer loosened something in my chest. When I arrived, Sophia opened the door and said, "You look tired." I replied, "I am." She took my bag and said, "Sit." I sat at her kitchen table like I had years ago after school. She pushed a mug toward me and said, "Drink." I said, "Thank you." She smiled and said, "You don't have to explain." I stared at the steam and said, "Emily thinks I'm overreacting." Sophia replied, "How do you feel?" I said, "Small." She nodded and said, "Then it matters." We talked quietly. I said, "Do you remember when I failed that exam?" She smiled and said, "You thought your life was over." I said, "You stayed up with me." She said, "You listened to me cry too." I laughed softly and said, "We always showed up." She said, "That hasn't changed." I felt something steady settle in me. She wasn't fixing me. She was letting me exist. My phone kept buzzing on the table. Sophia glanced at it and asked, "Emily?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Do you want to answer?" I shook my head and said, "Not right now." The screen lit up again. I said, "She's scared." Sophia replied, "She should be." I said, "That sounds harsh." Sophia said, "It sounds honest." I breathed out and said, "I'm not running away." She answered, "I know." I added, "I'm surviving." She said, "That's allowed." Emily called again. I watched it ring until it stopped. A message followed. I didn't read it. I said, "She never chased me before." Sophia replied, "People panic when control slips." I said, "I gave her everything." Sophia said, "You gave too much." I nodded and said, "She always had reasons." Sophia said, "And you always accepted them." That truth hurt, but it didn't crush me. We sat on the couch later, saying nothing. I said, "Thank you for choosing me." Sophia looked at me and said, "I never stopped." My chest tightened. I said, "I forgot what safe felt like." She replied, "You remember now." That night, I lay on the spare bed and stared at the ceiling. My phone stayed silent. For the first time in weeks, silence didn't scare me. I closed my eyes and slept. I woke once to another buzz, saw her name, and turned the phone face down. I said to the dark, "Tomorrow can wait." In my head, Emily's excuses lined up, neat and endless. I answered them without speaking. I said, "Love doesn't ask me to shrink." I remembered Sophia lending me notes, standing in rain, believing me before I believed myself. I breathed slowly. The room felt steady. I wasn't chosen because I begged. I was chosen because I was here. I rolled onto my side and rested, letting the night hold me, and I slept again, calm and whole. My body finally loosened. I thought about safety like a place, then realized it was a person. I whispered, "Thank you," to no one. The buzzing stopped. The waiting stopped. My mind slowed, and the sharp edges dulled. I wasn't measuring time anymore. I wasn't checking doors. I trusted the quiet. I trusted myself. Sleep came easy, heavy, and kind, and I let it take me. I promised myself I wouldn't chase explanations tonight. I promised I wouldn't answer calls that made me doubt my worth. I chose stillness. I chose rest. Somewhere far away, fear lost its voice. My breath evened out. My hands relaxed. Nothing needed fixing right now. Being safe was enough. Being seen was enough. I drifted deeper, without guilt, without plans, held by quiet I had forgotten. The night carried me gently. No alarms waited. No questions pressed. I let go completely. I slept, not as someone escaping, but as someone protected, knowing morning would come, and I would still be intact. That certainty wrapped around me like warmth, and I rested inside it, steady and unafraid, until sleep deepened fully. I didn't dream of answers or apologies, only quiet strength, and I slept on, safe. Morning could wait. I finally could rest. Without fear, without noise. At last. I was sitting at Sophia's table when the doorbell rang. Sophia looked at me and asked, "Do you want me to handle it?" I shook my head and said, "I will." When I opened the door, Emily stood there with red eyes and crossed arms. She said, "So this is where you're hiding." I replied, "I'm not hiding." She stepped inside and said, "You replace me fast." I closed the door and said, "That's not what this is." Emily pointed around and said, "You ran to her." I answered calmly, "I went somewhere safe." She laughed sharply and said, "So I'm unsafe now?" I said, "Your choices made it that way." She snapped, "You're punishing me." I replied, "I'm protecting myself." She said, "You didn't even try to fix us." I looked at her and said, "I tried quietly every day." She stepped closer and said, "You're choosing her over me." I took a breath and said, "I'm choosing peace." Emily said, "After everything we had." I nodded and said, "After everything I swallowed." She scoffed and said, "You're acting innocent." I replied, "I'm being honest." She said, "You didn't give me time." I answered, "I gave you understanding." Emily said, "I just didn't want to abandon someone who mattered." I held her gaze and repeated, "I just didn't want to abandon someone who mattered." She froze. The words hung between us. She whispered, "That's different." I said, "It didn't feel different to me." She said, "He needed me." I replied, "So did I." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I said, "I broke quietly while you offered sympathy to another man." She said, "I never meant to hurt you." I answered, "Impact matters more than intent." She said, "You're throwing us away." I replied, "You handed us away." She shook her head and said, "You're being cruel." I said, "I'm being clear." She said, "Say you forgive me." I replied, "I don't know how yet." Emily's voice cracked as she said, "I was confused." I answered, "Confusion doesn't erase damage." She said, "You could fight for me." I replied, "I fought alone already." She said, "So this is revenge?" I paused and said, "This is truth." She asked, "Do you even miss me?" I said, "I miss who I thought you were." She looked past me and said, "Does she know everything?" I said, "She knows enough." Emily laughed bitterly and said, "So I'm the villain now?" I replied, "You're the mirror." She wiped her face and said, "I never thought you'd leave." I said, "Neither did I." She whispered, "I didn't think you were strong enough." I nodded and said, "Neither did I." Emily stepped back and said, "You're really letting me go?" I answered, I already did. She waited for me to stop her. I didn't move. She turned toward the door and said, I hope you're happy. I replied, I hope you understand. She opened the door, crying, and left without another word. I stood still, feeling nothing and everything at once, knowing karma had started speaking for me. Sophia stood behind me and said, Are you okay? I said, I will be. She asked, Do you want to talk? I shook my head and said, Not tonight. She nodded and said, I'm here. I said, I know. We sat down and she said, You didn't yell. I replied, I didn't need to. She said, That hurt her. I answered, It hurt me first. My phone buzzed again. I looked at the screen and said, She's calling. Sophia asked, Will you answer? I said, No, she said, Good. I leaned back and said, I feel strange. She asked, How? I said, Lighter. She smiled and said, That's relief. I closed my eyes and said, I didn't win. She replied, You stopped losing. I thought about all the times I apologized for being hurt. I said, I won't do that again. Sophia said, You don't have to. I opened my eyes and said, I meant it when I repeated her words. Sophia said, She finally hurt herself. I nodded and said, That was enough. The room felt quiet, not heavy. I said, I think this is the beginning. Sophia asked, Of what? I answered, Of me. She smiled and said, I'm glad. I picked up my phone and turned it off. I said, I don't need noise. She replied, You never did. I breathed slowly and said, Karma didn't shout. Sophia said, It never does. I stood up and said, I feel done. She answered, Then rest. I nodded and walked toward the spare room. I said, Thank you. Sophia replied, Always. I closed the door and felt calm settle in my chest. I didn't chase her pain anymore. I chose myself, quietly, fully, at last. Emily asked me to meet her and said, Please, just once more. I agreed because silence felt heavier than truth. When she arrived, her voice shook as she said, I can't lose you. I replied, You already did. She started crying and said, I'll fix everything. I looked at her and said, You don't fix people. She stepped closer and whispered, I love you. I felt the pull and said, Love without respect is just attachment. She said, That's not fair. I answered, Neither was waiting. Emily grabbed my sleeve and said, I was confused. I replied, I was clear and ignored. She said, I chose wrong. I said, You chose repeatedly. She sobbed and said, I'm begging. I breathed slowly and said, I begged before. She asked, Don't you miss me? I said, I miss peace more. She shook her head and said, You're punishing me. I answered, I'm releasing myself. She said, Say you'll try again. I replied, Trying alone broke me. She whispered, I need you. I said, You needed attention. She said, You're being cold. I replied, I'm being honest. She looked at me and said, I'll cut him off. I answered, You already showed me who you protect first. She said, I'll prove it. I replied, Proof comes before damage. Emily fell into the chair and cried. She said, I don't recognize you. I said, I finally do. She asked, Is there nothing left? I answered, There's respect for myself. She said, So this is it. I nodded and said, This is the boundary. She wiped her face and said, I hate this. I replied, So did I. She stood and said, You're choosing distance. I said, I'm choosing health. Sophia's door creaked softly. Emily noticed and said, She's listening. I replied, She's supporting. Emily said, So I'm the outsider now. I answered, You stepped out first. She looked at me and said, You're stronger than I thought. I said, I had to become that. She whispered, I hope you regret this. I replied, I regret staying too long. She turned away, shaking, and left without another plea. I sat down and said to myself, don't chase. My hands trembled, but my voice inside stayed calm. I said, this is the choice. Sophia stepped in and asked, are you okay? I nodded and said, I chose me. She smiled gently and said, I'm proud of you. I replied, I was scared. She said, you still stood firm. I breathed out and said, I didn't want revenge. She said, you chose distance. I answered, that's my victory. Sophia handed me water and said, you didn't yell. I replied, I didn't need to. She said, that takes strength. I said, it took pain. She said, it ends growth. I nodded and said, I feel clear. She smiled and said, that's peace. My phone buzzed. I looked and said, it's her. Sophia asked, will you answer? I shook my head and said, not anymore. I stood by the window and said, I used to think love meant staying. Sophia replied, love also means leaving. I said, I'm choosing myself. She said, I see that. I turned off my phone and said, I won't explain again. She said, you don't have to. I felt steady. I felt whole. I felt done. Later, Sophia said, you handled that with grace. I answered, I learned from breaking. She said, what now? I replied, distance. She nodded and said, that's brave. I said, it's necessary. I lay back and closed my eyes. I didn't feel empty. I felt space opening where pain used to live. I said quietly, this choice defined me. Sophia answered, it saved you. Months passed, and Ryan told me one evening, Emily keeps asking about you. I replied, I don't want updates. He said, I figured, but you should know. I asked, know what? He answered, she regrets everything. I stayed quiet. Ryan added, Daniel moved on fast. I said, that sounds like him. Ryan said, she's alone now. I replied, I hope she learns. He asked, do you feel anything? I said, peace. Later, Sophia asked, did you hear from anyone? I said, Ryan mentioned Emily. She said, how did that land? I answered, like a closed door. Sophia smiled and said, that's growth. I nodded and said, I don't feel happy about it. She said, you don't have to. I replied, I just feel done. She said, that's enough. We sat together, comfortable in the quiet. A mutual friend messaged me and said, Emily keeps replaying everything. I didn't reply. Another message followed saying, she blames herself. I turned the phone face down. Sophia noticed and asked, you okay? I said, I don't need details. She said, good. I answered, karma doesn't need witnesses. Sophia smiled and said, it works quietly. I breathed out and felt steady. One night, Sophia found an old photo on my shelf and asked, do you want to keep this? It was a picture of Emily and me smiling. I looked at it and said, no, she asked, throw it away. I replied, no, I placed it in a box and said, archive. Sophia said, that's respectful. I nodded and said, it's closure. I didn't feel anger. I felt space. Emily sent one long message that stayed unread. Sophia asked, will you open it? I said, I don't need words now. She said, that's strong. I answered, it's calm. I deleted the message without reading it. My hands didn't shake. Sophia watched and said, you've changed. I replied, I stopped explaining. She smiled and said, I like this version. Ryan later said, she keeps asking why you won't respond. I answered, because silence answered me first. He nodded and said, that's fair. He added, she said losing you broke her. I replied, breaking taught me. Ryan said, you're not cruel. I said, I'm consistent. He laughed and said, "That's rare." I shrugged and said, "It's necessary." Sophia and I cooked dinner together. She said, "You seem lighter." I replied, "I don't carry questions anymore." She asked, "Do you ever miss her?" I said, "I miss the idea." She nodded and said, "Ideas don't hold you." I smiled and said, "People do." She looked at me and said, "We are growing." I answered, "Naturally." Nothing felt forced. Another friend said, "Daniel's engaged." I said, "That was quick." They replied, "Emily didn't see it coming." I said, "Neither did I once." I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. Sophia asked, "Do you believe in karma?" I said, "I believe in consequences." She said, "Same thing." I replied, "Maybe." We laughed softly. I sat alone one evening and opened the box again. I saw unsent drafts, old notes, and apologies I never owed. I said out loud, "You don't need my hands." I closed the box and placed it away. Sophia asked from the doorway, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." She smiled and said, "Good." I realized the power shift was complete. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't watching her fall. I was walking forward, steady, untouched, and finally free. I stood by the window and said to myself, "You're still here." Sophia looked over and asked, "Where else would you be?" I smiled and said, "Running, maybe." She replied, "You stopped doing that." I nodded and said, "I stayed." She asked, "With what?" I answered, "With my values." She said, "That's new." I replied, "That's earned." The air felt calm, not heavy, and I like that. Ryan called and said, "You sound different." I asked, "Better or worse?" He said, "Clear." I replied, "I finally am." He asked, "Do you think about her?" I said, "Not the way I used to." He said, "That's winning." I answered, "It's peace." He laughed and said, "You always aimed low." I replied, "I aim right now." We hung up without unfinished thoughts. Sophia asked, "Do you hate Emily?" I shook my head and said, "No." She asked, "Forgive her?" I replied, "I outgrew that version of me." She said, "That's honest." I added, "I don't carry anger." She smiled and said, "You learned." I answered, "I paid to learn." We shared a quiet laugh that didn't hide pain. It acknowledged it and moved on. I found an old message draft and said out loud, "You never sent this." Sophia asked, "Do you want to?" I replied, "No." She said, "Why?" I answered, "I don't need her understanding." She nodded and said, "You understand yourself." I deleted the draft and felt nothing pull me back. The past loosened its grip without a fight. Later, Sophia said, "You never competed with the past here." I replied, "I was never asked to." She said, "That matters." I answered, "It changes everything." She asked, "Are you afraid?" I said, "Of going backward." She smiled and said, "You won't." I believed her because I believed me. That was new and solid. Emily crossed my mind once, briefly. I said, "I hope she's okay." Sophia looked at me and asked, "Truly?" I said, "Yes." She said, "That's closure." I replied, "It's growth." I didn't replay arguments or rehearse apologies. I didn't imagine alternate endings. I accepted the one I chose. It fit. Ryan later said, "You look lighter." I replied, "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine." He said, "Any regrets?" I thought and said, "I stayed too long." He nodded and said, "And now?" I answered, "I stay with myself." He smiled and said, "That's the win." I agreed. Sophia and I sat together and she said, "You don't need permission anymore." I replied, "I never did." She said, "But now you know." I said, "Now I trust it." She asked, "What will you do next?" I answered, "Live without shrinking." She said, "I like that plan." I did too. I looked around and said, I didn't lose love. Sophia asked, what did you lose? I replied, illusions. She said, and what did you gain? I answered, self-respect. She smiled and said, that lasts. I felt steady, grounded, and finished with the parts of me that accepted less. That night, I said quietly, I stayed. Sophia replied, you won. I corrected her and said, I finally chose myself. She nodded and said, that's the same thing. I closed my eyes and felt calm settle in. No applause followed. No revenge scene played. Just quiet triumph. I didn't need more. I stayed, and that was enough.